All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back, or for the first time, to Crusade Against Ignorance. Today, I figured I would like to talk about an issue that's very, very globally relevant, but in a different sort of way. We're obviously facing quite the global crisis, disaster, pandemic. The World Health Organization, I believe, is now calling it the worst disaster since World War II. So to be living through that, there are a lot of questions, very scary, and there's a lot to work through. So I thought it might be fun. Well, that's not the right word for it in a dire time such as this, but maybe important is a better word to go through kind of some interesting questions actually in philosophy that are raised by the threat of coronavirus. So, as you can see, the title of this little presentation I've put together is Coronavirus and Other Disasters, Questions of Ethics in a Time of Emergency. Because in times of emergency, there are a lot of unprecedented moves that have to happen in politics, economics, both globally, at the national level, at the state level, at local levels. Like there's a lot that happens. The economy has already been impacted. The Dow Jones has had a historic tank. So, um, yeah, there's obviously a lot to work through. So, I thought it might be helpful or interesting to just work through a little bit and not offer solutions on my part, just kind of go through and lay out some of the ethical questions and problems that are raised by this pandemic. So let's go through first here, and I'd like to start with kind of which fields of philosophy are going to be of primary importance for us here. There may be more, and maybe there are, and some of these are more applicable than others. Maybe there's some I've left out. Maybe there's some that don't need to be in there, or they're subsumed by others. But this should be a good starting place. So there's applied ethics, bioethics, environmental ethics, political philosophy, philosophy of economics, and epistemology. Now, of course, a lot of political philosophy ultimately comes out of ethics, which comes out of the branch of philosophy called axiology, which is the study of value. But let's just go through and talk about these mean real quick. Applied ethics is, well, pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's kind of very broad. It's a sort of newer and very in-depth field of philosophy that tackles hardcore ethical questions like when killing in war is justified, things like abortion, euthanasia, what have you. So just applying ethical theories and questions of ethics to very specific real world examples, things like that. So obviously, we're going to be applying ethics to a lot of scenarios and things like this. So it's quickly becoming one of my favorite branches and fields of philosophy, and it's very relevant here. Next is bioethics, as I have here, which is pretty much, again, what it sounds like. It's questions of ethics pertaining specifically to biological research, medicinal research, and things like that. So there are some great introductory videos on this on YouTube you can look up from medical organizations, but it's essentially questions of ethics surrounding the practice of medicine and experimentation and all of that. So obviously that's very relevant when we're dealing with a pandemic, disease. Environmental ethics. So this one may not seem relevant at first, but it is, and it will more so at the end. I'll explain more of it, but I'll explain more how it's relevant towards the end. But essentially, yeah, environmental ethics deals with questions of how we should act and live in regards and in relation to the environment. So in regards to nature, what measures are right or wrong in regards to affecting the environment. So that'll come into play a little bit later. But for example, already we've seen that coronavirus has actually had some good impacts in the world on nature, such as dolphins returning to certain rivers because of the less pollution, people in China being able to see the sky again because of the blue, clear sky, because of less smog. So it's been rather good for the environment to halt global human production like this. But of course, we know that, we're kind of either in or approaching the Anthropocene where humans are affecting a lot of the environment. And that's not necessarily a good thing because we're affecting it for the worse. So we'll get a little more to those questions towards the end. Political philosophy, again, still sort of within the umbrella of ethics. We're dealing with how we should act, but more broadly, how we should organize ourselves and distribute benefits and burdens of living in larger human organizations and societies. So there are obviously going to be a ton of questions of political philosophy here in terms of how nations, how states, how the government should handle these things, how it should prepare for them, how it should respond, what measures it should take, what measures it can take and cannot take, has the right, legitimacy of power, and we'll get into all that. Philosophy of economics is next, which usually is a field of ethics, kind of dealing with the right and wrong action within economics, and we're going to have to deal with a lot of that, of course, as we've seen economic tank, and it's going to only get worse. People are not able to work as much, so there's sort of a halt. So there will be questions of economics, which will, again, all of this will further extrapolate in following slides. And then finally, epistemology. This one may not seem relevant, and it's not as much as the others, but there are questions of correct attainment of knowledge, and that's epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge in philosophy. So there will be questions of that, and I think it'll be one of our, in the next two slides, we'll see some of that. So now we'll get into really quickly just kind of what some of the big questions are, and a lot of these will be explored a little bit in more detail, but of course, allocation of resources. There are a lot of resources that need to be allocated in a time like this, whether it be testing kits, masks, gloves, medical resources of any kinds, or just money, just pure capital. We've had to see multiple corporate bailouts, even stimulus packages, adding to the national debt. So how to allocate resources properly is one of the big questions, which we'll get into a little bit more later. And of course, how do we respond as nations? How should we treat other people when this is going on, both in our communities and at a global level? We'll tackle some questions of xenophobia and the like. And then how should nations be prepared and respond to pandemics? The other big question is, of course, political power. As I mentioned, the justifications of state power and whether or not that is extended in a time like this. The issues of staying properly informed when we're going through an issue that is this immense, which is where the epistemology kind of comes in a little bit, and we'll get into, I think, in the next slide. Questions of global mutual aid, how we should help other nations, if at all, how we should expect them to help us. I mean, Italy had to send us like 500 testing kits. This was just after Joe Biden, and I'm sure many online libertarians made fun of Italy's universal healthcare program not being able to handle this. And, it was just after that they had to send us 500 coronavirus testing kits because our healthcare system is one of the worst in human history here in the United States. That is where I'm making this from. And then, of course, I mentioned bioethics is in the last slide as one of our topics, but the big questions in bioethics are, of course, medicine, doctors, research. So having doctors really are putting themselves at a lot of risk in continuing to treat people, whether or not they should have to do that or should be able to do that is a question. And then there are a lot of questions in medicine. For one thing, allocation of medicinal resources, but also in terms of testing. We have to test new things like vaccines. So the ethical questions that raises, there's a lot there in bioethics. So bioethics is one of our primary philosophical topics, as we saw, but it's also a lot of the big questions are contained within that field of research. So now we're going to look at a little bit of that epistemology point, talking a little bit about information, media, knowledge, and there will be some points snuck in here also about how we should treat other people. So to start off, we're going to talk a little bit about conspiracy theories. Now, I'm actually planning on doing some future content on conspiracy theories because they interest me. There's a good video. There's a couple little videos that would be good to start off with if you're interested. Noam Chomsky has like a 9-minute video talking about them, about how occasionally there are real conspiracies, but what is commonly referred to as conspiracy theories, the stuff you find in certain corners of the internet, is a lot of it is just crazy. And there are plenty of just whack job conspiracy theories. And of course, there's nothing wrong with being skeptical, and occasionally we should be skeptical of the state stories, because of course the state has committed a lot of atrocities, but there are also times when conspiracy theories are just ridiculous, and this is one of them. There were conspiracy theories about the coronavirus being some sort of manufactured bioweapon, and that was found out to be false just recently by scientists. It was not manufactured. It was naturally occurring, if we can use that terminology. So a lot of times when there's panic like this, you'll have conspiracy theories about bioweaponry or manufactured economic. I mean, that was when it first came out. There was a lot of people thought that it was just being blown out of proportions. This doesn't relate directly to a conspiracy theory, but almost immediately, most of the right wing thought this was being blown out of proportion, and it was somehow it was trying to be used by the other side to tank the economy, to smear Trump and hurt his chances of re-election. So when it first came out, it was, of course, a conspiracy, and Trump himself didn't even acknowledge it was a pandemic in January. So at first, it was treated like just something massively blown out of proportion. But of course, that was not true and is not true, and it's become a huge problem. And now everybody's backtracking. Trump's now saying that he called it a pandemic, but that's on our political misinformation point, because those obviously kind of go hand in hand a little bit, right? Conspiracy theories and political misinformation, because people tend to latch on to conspiracies, and sometimes those conspiracy theories are promoted by people like Trump. And whether or not you could call that a conspiracy theory is a little bit, whatever. But bioweaponry, that's certainly a conspiracy theory. That this is just like some state cover up to cover up something else is a conspiracy theory. To be sure, there are some things the state's doing right now, and probably some things I don't even know about, that we should be paying attention to. But that doesn't mean that this is some sort of cover up. I mean, and so this is where epistemology comes in, is properly understanding knowledge. Of course, there's also anti-vaxxers. This is an interesting time, because it's like, well, this is what it looks like. We don't have vaccines. Diseases like this, viruses, ravage the globe, really, global economy. So it's just kind of interesting. I mean, conspiracy theorists like anti-vaxxers just have terrible epistemology. I mean, they have like an ass backwards skepticism that ends up being. And so this is a question of ethics, because a lot of times being too committed to a certain conspiracy theory is actually ethically wrong in the case of anti-vaxxers, for sure, because of course you're suscepting a child to possibly contracting a deadly disease because you think vaccines or something's wrong with vaccines. So there can be ethical problems with being a conspiracy theorist. Again, there's nothing wrong with being skeptical, but there are certain conspiracy theories that do have ethical implications that are wrong, which is why properly understanding epistemology relates to ethics in this scenario. So again, we talked a little about this already. There's political misinformation out the wazoo while this is going on, and the media is covering it a lot, which is another reason people thought it was blown out of proportion. When the media covers something this much, their only recourse is, oh, it's being blown out of proportion. But of course, no, it's very important, which is why it's being. But there is still misinformation, which is why correctly checking sources and understanding epistemology. So this is kind of a little sub-branch almost of political epistemology. You have to understand when politicians or the proselytizers of certain political talking points are wrong, and where to fact check them on sources and things like that. So I talked about this already with Trump. Again, early in January, he said that it wouldn't become a pandemic, that we wouldn't even have 15 cases, all this nonsense. Now he's saying that he was calling it a pandemic before anybody else did, and that, if there's only 100,000 deaths, we'll call this a win. So, I mean, he's completely backtracking, and is, of course, but as always with Trump, his supporters don't care how much he lies or says bullcrap. They'll always support him, almost as a general point. So watch out for ethical questions of political misinformation, because again, wrong information can lead to, and xenophobia is one of the best examples, I think, of this, is why you shouldn't call it the Chinese virus. I mean, that's what another thing Trump was doing, a lot of his supporters were doing, was calling it the Chinese virus. And the justifications for this were almost always nonsense. They were saying, well, it came from China, and the Chinese government needs to be held accountable. And it's like, okay, fine. But xenophobia, for those who are not aware, is discriminating against people of another country, or treating people from another country as lesser for whatever reason. And that's really the only reason one would call it the Chinese virus, is to promote xenophobia. Because sure, you want to hold the Chinese government accountable. It's very easy to do that without calling it the Chinese virus. There were many instances of racial violence against Asian people because of the coronavirus and because of xenophobia, and that's definitely not helped by labeling it things like the Chinese virus. In fact, the World Health Organization warns against giving any kind of virus or disease national names for this exact reason. It promotes just bad ethical knowledge. I don't know if that's the correct way to put that, but essentially, this just promotes xenophobic attacks, racism, and it can incite violence. So there's obviously some ethical problems with misinformation in this sense. So there's no good reason to label viruses like this after where they originated necessarily. So the warnings about xenophobia and the ethical implications that can have, because again, we've seen racial violence, and that's very obviously wrong. There's also questions in the information and knowledge section on how we should properly prepare for pandemics. You may not be aware of this, but the National Security Advisor's pandemic response team was removed, and Donald Trump never replaced the head of the National Pandemic Response Team. And this was 2 years ago. And so we did not have a head of pandemic response at the time this happened, because Trump never replaced him. Of course, we've had to backtrack on that now, but not having a head of a pandemic response team for 2 years is obviously not good. So being properly informed about how to respond to pandemics is extremely important, and it's something our government mishandled badly. Our government mishandled this very badly, so that's why some of these questions are very important. And all of this, the conspiracy theories about vaccines, political misinformation about xenophobia, preparing for pandemics, and not having a pandemic response team. And there are other questions I'll raise about this a little bit later, but this all comes down to you should definitely listen to scientists, and it's ethically right to listen to scientists because there are a lot of problems that can arise when scientists are ignored. So it's actually almost a moral imperative to pay attention to scientific consensus and fact check that against political narratives. So that's all very important. And we'll talk about that a little more later as it relates to things like climate change and environmental ethics. But even in this case, you think about bioweaponry. I mean, that was scientifically disproven. So pay attention to the science. Anti-vaxxers, their talking points have all been disproven by scientific consensus. Xenophobia, the World Health Organization warns against it. A lot of these things, and then not having a pandemic response team, that's all science. This is all science. And of course, we have an administration and pretty much an entire political party that makes a lot of their talking points off of ignoring or going against science. But it's actually morally wrong in some cases, as I think we've seen, to ignore science, and because it can sometimes end up affecting human lives and actions. So let's move on a little bit. So now we're going to talk a little bit about questions specifically of economics and ethics. Philosophy of economics, I mentioned, is one of our fields before. So there have been recent proposals by the right wing, particularly, I believe it was Glenn Beck, could be wrong, but double check me on that, and Donald Trump even, who talked about getting the economy, and Trump said he wanted to get the economy back up and running by Easter, and then there were proposals by right-wing pundits like Beck to go back to work despite health risks, like people needed to for the good of the economy. So that gets into my second little bullet point here, is weighing the economy versus lives, which is what the right wing is now doing. Our GDP growth is being weighed against actual human lives. Now, a couple people, even people who are generally very moral and care about life, have even tried to, on a soft way, defend this point by saying we do have to look at, and let's be clear here, it's not that we don't have to think about the well-being of the economy, because of course that is going to have implications for people's lives, and it is going to, but some people have defended it by saying, like, we do have to start thinking about the economy, and it's going to be, it's part of national well-being. So we're not weighing lives, we're just saying that the economy does need to be taken into account. And the economy does need to be taken into account. But we can't act as if, growth in the economy is somehow something we should sacrifice human lives for, I don't think. I think the only way to justify a position like this is a purely consequentialist one. Purely, because again, there's nothing wrong with taking consequences into account. Every moral theory should do that. But when you say that, lives ought to be sacrificed so that future lives can perhaps be saved, or there can be the eventual consequences of sacrificing these lives will be a stronger economy, and this will be overall beneficial. We're appealing to purely utilitarian, well, a certain kind of utilitarian. I think it's direct utilitarian. The consequentialist, this is just straightforwardly, and maybe that's not wrong. Again, if you are a consequentialist, there are good consequentialist theories. See guys like Peter Singer. But if you're not a consequentialist, I don't see how this point can be made from any kind of deontological or virtue standpoint. But I think, again, this is a question of ethics we have to ask ourselves is, are we really in a position where we're weighing human lives versus economic growth? It's heinous at a level, but we do have to ask questions about how to handle the economy in times like this. Which is why there have been multiple corporate bailouts already. There was I believe it was a $1.5 trillion Wall Street bailout. Boeing asked for a $50 billion bailout. So most people on the right-wing libertarian side of things, at least from what I've seen, have had the decency to shut up through most of this. But a couple of them, mostly they've had just horrible takes on this from the ones that have talked, but a couple have been intellectually honest enough to at least recognize that this is a failure of the market. And even if it weren't, it's very obvious that free market measures could obviously not handle something like this. There's no way, and not to mention all the other things that are wrong with total absolutist free market positions. But there are corporate bailouts, and of course they appeal to this by saying, oh, well, sometimes free marketeers will say, well, yeah, corporate bailouts, they should just let these companies die. And that would be the true free market position. So I can still preach free markets while these corporate bailouts. But of course, they don't understand how tendency towards monopoly works, and corporations affect policy. So free markets lead to things like bailouts in a sort of paradoxical move. But even if it were, this is just a failure of the market. These things can't prop themselves up, so they need help from big daddy government. And that's, when a global crisis like this happens, it is the collapse of libertarian ideology, which we'll get into a little bit more in the next slide. Because libertarians and those who are free markets also have problems with taxes. But in times like this, things like stimulus packages are needed so people can, and again, we're going further into debt, but sometimes you have to do that because it's an immediate risk. So we have to keep the economy going. Now, this is a better option. So it's kind of funny because we're weighing the economy versus lives, but then we have problems with raising the debt. Obviously, it seems almost mind-numbingly obvious that pumping more money into the economy, and not in an inflationary sense, not just printing more money, but reallocating resources is the right move. And of course, we could do this without heavy increases in taxation on everyone if we would just tax the rich like we should have been doing this whole time. Again, but I'll try to steer away from a lot of those points because I'm not trying to give my opinion totally. Obviously, you know what my opinion is if you're familiar with my content at all, but this is just talking about the questions. So it seems like, we don't want to increase our national debt, but in the case of things like stimulus packages, if we're going to save the economy, it's better to grab the horn and bite the bullet on increasing debt for a stimulus package as opposed to just putting people back in the economy. So we can either generate wealth by throwing people back in the economy or generate capital and having them work despite health risks, or we can pump more money in or reallocate money. This seems like a better option to me, ethically speaking, but weighing those options is a question of ethics that we have to deal with. So I'm interested in different takes on that. Stimulus packages are needed to just increase spending and fuel economic growth, but also to buy things like supplies. I mean, medical supplies, ethics of taxation. Like, should the government tax people more in this case? But of course, it's really hard to do that because a lot of people are getting laid off. So no, taxing people more isn't the answer because people don't have less money now, actually, so that'd be bad. And then, of course, this is also raising some interesting questions about worker unions and the necessity of labors. I put this little thing in parentheses here, this little facetious little jab. Us on the left call this sort of necessary of just common laborers principle, the principle of no shit. Obviously, laborers create the wealth at the bottom, which is why the corporate CEOs are asking now for bailouts, because the people that are getting laid off, the people at the bottom, are the ones actually generating the wealth. Of course, us on the left, we know this. We have known this, and we've been talking about this for quite some time. But now people are actually seeing it, that it's not celebrities or CEOs that actually matter to the world. It's doctors, it's service personnel, it's delivery personnel. So it's a lot of the people at the bottom that are not, and the burger flippers, the people working in grocery stores, a lot of the jobs that are condemned or spit on or looked down upon by the right wing in better times. And some people on the left too are more centrist. They're now the ones that are keeping pretty much the entire economy together. And again, us on the left, we're like, yeah, no shit. We've known this and been trying to tell you this the entire time. Workers need more rights. They need more democratic control because they're the ones that are actually keeping the economy going, generating wealth. They're the ones that are actually doing anything. And of course, there will be rejoinders to this. They'll all be bad, but I'm happy to hear them. And then, of course, there are a couple other questions of mutual aid. I mean, the government can't do everything. The businesses can't do everything. In fact, they can't really do much of anything except get bailed out by the government, it seems like, at this point. So there are questions now in economic ethics of mutual aid. How should we help each other, especially through things like shortages? If we have shortage of, say, toilet paper or food, we're going to need to help each other. To what extent should we have to do this? To what extent should we, if we can? So there are a ton of interesting questions. This is just a very brief overview and hopefully just a little introduction into some of the questions faced in ethics by the economy going through this heavy duress. So now let's look at some questions I alluded to a little bit earlier on political power. So we talked a little bit about like libertarianism and free markets here. And so this is when global crises like this happen, you hear less from libertarians. And the ones you hear from, it just gets increasingly ridiculous because their view of rights and aggression and like the non-aggression principle would obviously be absolutely disastrous in a time like this. Think about that next little slide I have there, stay-at-home orders. So under libertarianism, there's this doctrine of like private property rights. There's also this kind of idea of self-ownership and like your right to own and yourself. So obviously the state doesn't own you. They don't have the right to tell you to do anything. So there wouldn't be, in a perfect libertarian world, stay-at-home orders wouldn't be a thing, or at least we wouldn't be compelled to obey them because, oh, I own myself. I can go out and do whatever I want. So any people stay-at-home orders would be voluntary. But we saw very early on in this crisis that voluntary stay-at-home orders don't work. So in an ideally libertarian world, this thing would have spread to millions already because the only people staying at home voluntarily would be a select few. Because again, there are people out doing spring break parties, even old people going out to things like bingo night. I mean, the voluntary stay-at-home stuff doesn't work. So libertarians would view it as a violation of the non-aggression principle if the state were to quote unquote force you or order you to stay at home, and they don't think there's any moral, there's any compelling moral reason to actually do this because I don't think state commands are legitimate. And I have some sympathy for libertarian points about the state. I'm a libertarian socialist, so I'm a left-winger. I'm an anarchist, actually, in a left-wing vein. So of course, I'm not a huge fan of like state power. I'm very critical of it too, actually. But this libertarian particular view of the non-aggression principle and self-ownership are just disastrous, and we're kind of seeing how their views of political power would be absolutely disastrous and apocalyptic for the world if they were. Because again, if in an ideally libertarian world, this thing would have spread to millions already, many more would be dead. So, but it does raise questions of things like stay-at-home orders. Should the state have the power to tell you to stay at home? How should they enforce that? We have to roll out the National Guard and keep people at home? What do you do? Like the police, make sure you stay at home, or you get arrested for being outside too long. I mean, there are some interesting questions and some scary questions. I mean, it does sound rather Orwellian to have, the National Guard rolling past your house with rifles, making sure you stay inside. But this is a disaster, and obviously the suspension of certain rights during a disaster is different than saying the state should have that power simpliciter, which gets us into the question of how much power should the state have in a crisis? Should the state have the same rights and access to power always, or in a crisis, should certain rights be defended? Now, of course, if you think certain human rights are, say, essential, they're essential to persons, they're foundational, of course they can't be suspended. And maybe suspended is the wrong word. Obviously, and obviously this only applies to some rights because it's not like you could ever suspend your right to life in a crisis and the state could just come to your house and shoot you for some appeal to the greater good, because there are scary utilitarian implications of like state action just for the greater good. And I get how this is scary. So I do have sympathy for the libertarian points and some of the libertarian takes I've seen online. But I also think that we do have a moral duty, and it is, again, this raises interesting ethical questions, but I think that we should, at an ethical level, stay home. And if the state has to force people to stay home through force of law, so be it. We kind of need whatever we can to stop this from happening. It doesn't make you a utilitarian or a consequentialist, but you do have to think about consequences in cases like this. So this also raises questions of political power of, do we need a stronger global scale state? Because the UN is, of course, not super effective, and we're increasingly facing global problems as a species. So do we need a stronger state at the global scale to deal with things like this? Um, and of course, that's a scary thought for libertarians and for me as well. But there is also the very real possibility that there are some global problems that are going to require global solutions. And if we have a bunch of disparate nations squabbling about things, then it's just not going to get done. I mean, this is why the UN has been ineffective, because there are things like the Paris Climate Accord that are good. We do need global efforts to stop climate change. But when the US can just pull out of that or kill thousands of people in a third world country with impunity and not be held accountable for it, our global government, or at least our global legal accounting, is just not effective enough. So do we need some sort of stronger measures on global government for nations in order to combat things like this when they happen? Maybe it could be a similar case to our governments, where nations suspend some of their rights the same way people do during a crisis and secede power to a stronger global government that's governed democratically by multiple, maybe something like that. Again, interesting questions of implications of global government in cases like this. And of course, then there are questions now of someone who's very pro-democracy like me as to facing disasters in terms of like, would the bureaucracy of democracy be effective in countering disasters like this? I mean, my political view isn't airtight in terms of answering things like this. There are interesting questions of people's rights. But again, I think going back to the necessity of laborers, I think people like that, workers, do need more democracy, say in the workplace, to protect themselves and their families and have more rights protected in a time like this. Increased wages, increased rights, increased health precautions, things like that. And then, of course, this applies back to the stay-at-home orders and the principles of rights, the power of the state. There should be maybe more voting done on things like this, more democratic measures to put this in place. So I think, again, democracy is almost always a good answer, and how it work out practically in a situation like this, I don't fully know, but it is interesting to think about democratic principles and global disasters. So just some food for thought on the efficiency and legitimacy of political power in a situation like this. So just some final notes on and thoughts on kind of what we're going to be facing going forward. Uh, I think this kind of illustrates failures of neoliberalism and the need for a new political vision. I think actually this has been needed and this has been evident for quite a while. But neoliberalism being kind of the continuation of a tradition that's very hyper individualistic in a sense, but also very pro capitalist, kind of like sort of what we think of as conservatives in a classical sense or right wing libertarians. But obviously, this kind of, weirdly governed, weird form of government that we have, and the strange economic order we have is collapsing and can't really face things like this very productively. So we do need new politics. And again, going back to my democracy point, I think we need a more democratic order, a different economic order. So this is just me in terms of my opinion on these things. I think, democratic socialism would be a much better way to handle a lot of these problems. But the point of this is to give you some food for thought on what you think. So, does this correctly illustrate kind of some failures of our political order? Do we need a new politics, or do we just need to bandage up some problems with our political systems? Interested as to what people think. Some other thoughts we need, obviously, there's some more education needed in philosophy and science, going back to my earlier points. Scientific knowledge and trusting scientific consensus is extremely important, and in many cases, it's ethically relevant. So there needs to be more widespread education. I mean, the United States, especially in certain parts, is very anti-science. There's not quite a national consensus on climate change, despite there being a scientific consensus on it. There's pseudoscience still taught in some schools about the age of the Earth, the universe, how it all got here, things like that. Um, so America's kind of got this penchant for pseudoscience, which is not only intellectually bankrupt and just bad, it can also have ethical implications that are bad when we get to situations like this. I mean, we have the doctors and scientists working on these problems, but when most people aren't aware of how to correctly think about what's going on in terms of epistemology and scientific consensus, and it's going to create problems, which is where philosophy comes in as well. We need more just general critical thinking, more logic, correct epistemology to avoid wrong kinds of skepticism that gets you to things like conspiracy theories. So a lot of this philosophy science, having correct knowledge of science, goes hand in hand with having proper philosophical training. So I think we need more education at lower levels in thinking critically, but this is of course difficult to do, and as well as understanding science. And of course, you have some interesting thoughts on like why ethics matters right now. Of course, I don't know if this is a question that would come up, but ethics is the study of human action, how to live properly, how humans ought live, how we ought conduct ourselves, the study of values, so right action, wrong action, things like that. And there again, ethics is a broad term, but I think as I've hopefully explained a little bit, there are many questions in ethics about certain applied scenarios and bioethics, medicine that are really important. And it matters right now because we have to be able to have good conversations about these things. We have to be able to think about them critically and correctly, have good conversations. And I think being able to just to be prepared, so being prepared for global disasters like this or for any kind of crisis, it's important to kind of have worked out what you think about ethics and right and wrong action. So there's a lot there. And there are many fields of ethics that matter, in fact, as we talked about the environment. And speaking of the environment, this coronavirus is very bad, but the simple fact of the matter is climate change within a century or two will be much, much worse, and we're not even close to ready. So all that we talked about in terms of not having a pandemic response team and all the problems of being politically prepared for disasters like this virus, climate change is going to be much more disastrous. It's going to be irreversible at a point, and it's going to be inevitable, irreversible, it's going to be much worse. I mean, there are going to be temperatures in the Middle East. It's going to reach temperatures where people won't be able to even live there anymore. So the refugee crisis in Europe will get much worse. Sea levels will rise and displace housing for 20 million people or more, again, within the next century or so, if we don't take measures now. So all the questions we've talked about political power, the state, environment, ethics, this all goes back into we're facing much bigger problems. I mean, there's obviously the always impending threat of nuclear war, but climate change is something we're affecting almost undeniably, again, with the anthropogenic global warming, Anthropocene era. Um, it's going to be a much worse global disaster. It could eventually, if we don't do something, it could get to a point where it will be genuinely apocalyptic. So all these questions we're talking about with coronavirus are very important because this is definitely not the last disaster we're going to have to face. There'll probably be more even before climate change, but that's just another real world example of why these things are important to think about, because there's a lot scarier stuff to come. But anyways, hopefully you enjoyed the video. This is an overview of kind of some of the ethical questions that are raised in a disaster like coronavirus and why they're important. So I'm interested in hearing people's thoughts, so feel free to, again, shoot me an email, which is in the description of my channel, and commenting on the video, like, subscribe, all that nonsense. But thank you for being here. I hope everybody's staying safe, stay at home, wash your hands, all that. You know the speech. I just hope everybody's staying safe, wish you all well. And yeah, thanks again for tuning in.